It was supposed to be an ordinary summer night. Three women returned home after celebrating one of life's happiest milestones. They changed into comfortable clothes, locked the worries of the day outside, and prepared for another morning that to everyone who loved them seemed guaranteed to come. But when the sun rose over their quiet neighborhood, the house remained strangely silent. Their beds had been slept in. Their purses sat exactly where they had been left. Their cars were still parked in the driveway. A family dog wandered through the rooms as if waiting for someone to call its name. Yet the three women themselves had vanished. No cries for help had awakened the neighbors. No shattered windows hinted at a violent struggle. No trail led away from the home. It was as though the night had quietly erased them, leaving behind everything they owned except the one thing that mattered most: their presence. Imagine standing in the doorway of that house. Nothing appears out of place at first glance. The television is still there, personal belongings remain untouched. The kitchen looks as though someone could walk in at any moment to pour a cup of coffee. Every room carries the unmistakable feeling that life has simply been interrupted. Yet with every passing second, one terrifying realization settles in. Three people cannot simply disappear. Someone must have seen something. Someone must know something. And yet, more than 3 decades later, investigators are still asking the very same questions that haunted them on that first morning. What happened inside that house? Why was there no obvious evidence of a struggle? And how could three adults leave behind almost everything they owned without leaving behind even the smallest clue explaining where they went? The case would soon become one of the most baffling missing person investigations in American history. Detectives searched tirelessly for answers, interviewing witnesses, following tips from across the country, and examining every piece of evidence they could find. Thousands of leads poured in. Some appeared promising before collapsing under scrutiny. Others raised even more questions than answers. Rumors spread through neighborhoods, television broadcasts, newspapers, and eventually across the internet, each offering a different explanation for what might have happened. But despite decades of investigation, the central mystery has remained stubbornly unsolved. Every new theory seems to uncover another unanswered question, and every possible answer leads investigators back to the same haunting silence that greeted them on that summer morning. This is a true story. Every confirmed detail you are about to hear is based on documented investigative records, witness statements, and publicly available reporting. Where theories exist, we'll clearly separate them from established facts. Because in a case surrounded by decades of speculation, the truth deserves to stand on its own. Somewhere between the known evidence and the unanswered questions lies the story of three ordinary women whose lives became linked forever to one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. The longer investigators searched, the more they realized this was far more than a missing person case. It became a puzzle where nearly every clue seemed to point in a different direction, and where even the smallest overlooked detail could change the entire investigation. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Tonight, we reopen a case that has refused to fade with time. A mystery that has frustrated detectives, fascinated investigators, and left an entire community searching for answers that have never come. Because what investigators discovered inside that house only made the mystery even stranger. To understand why this case continues to haunt investigators more than 3 decades later, we have to go back to the final hours before the silence began. It was Saturday, June 6, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri. Schools had just celebrated graduation, and across the city, families gathered for photographs, congratulations, and parties that marked the beginning of a new chapter. It was a night filled with excitement and optimism. For many young people, it was a celebration of everything that lay ahead. For 18-year-old Suzie Streeter and her best friend, Stacy McCall, it was a night they had looked forward to for months. Neither of them, nor anyone around them, had the slightest reason to believe they were living through the final hours of their lives that anyone could ever account for. Suzie Streeter had recently graduated from Kickapoo High School. Friends described her as independent, energetic, and someone who enjoyed spending time with the people closest to her. She had plans for the future, like so many teenagers standing at the edge of adulthood, and graduation represented more than a ceremony. It was the beginning of a new journey. Her closest friend, Stacy McCall, had also reached that important milestone. The two had shared countless memories growing up together, and graduation night was another memory they expected to look back on for years to come. Their families celebrated alongside them, proud of everything they had accomplished and excited about what came next. There was every reason to believe this would simply become another happy summer evening remembered through photographs and stories. Waiting for Suzie at home was her mother, Sherrill Levitt. At 47 years old, Sherrill had built a life centered around her family. Friends often spoke of her warmth, her welcoming personality, and the pride she took in maintaining her home. She had recently completed renovations to the house where she and Suzie lived on East Delmer Street, creating a comfortable place they both enjoyed. The modest home sat in a quiet residential neighborhood where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Neighbors knew one another, children played outside during the day, and evenings were usually peaceful. It was the kind of neighborhood where people rarely imagined becoming the focus of national headlines. As graduation festivities continued throughout Springfield, Suzie and Stacy moved from one celebration to another. Like many graduates that night, their plans shifted as the evening unfolded. They attended parties where classmates gathered to celebrate together, catching up with friends and enjoying the excitement that only graduation night could bring. Witnesses later remembered seeing them smiling, talking with friends, and behaving exactly as anyone would expect. Nothing about their actions suggested fear, concern, or the possibility that they believed they were in danger. Those ordinary interactions would later become critically important as investigators worked to reconstruct the final confirmed timeline. Originally, the two friends had planned to spend the night elsewhere. According to those who knew them, they intended to stay with another friend after the celebrations ended. But like many last-minute decisions made by teenagers after a busy evening, those plans changed. The house where they intended to stay already had too many people gathered there, making it difficult to find space for everyone. Rather than crowd into an already packed home, Suzie suggested a different idea. They would simply spend the night at her house instead. It was a practical decision that required little thought. Stacy's parents expected she would be staying with friends after graduation festivities, so nothing about the change seemed unusual. In fact, it probably felt like the safest and easiest option available. Sometime after 2:00 a.m., Suzie and Stacy arrived at Sherrill's home on East Delmer Street. Witnesses would later place them there during the early hours of Sunday morning. Their cars remained parked outside, visible from the street. Inside the home, Sherrill was believed to have already settled in for the night. Nothing suggested that anything unusual happened as the two young women entered the house. There were no reports of arguments, no emergency calls, no neighbors hearing screams or signs of violence. If anyone noticed activity at the house during those early morning hours, nothing stood out enough to raise alarm. It was simply another quiet summer night in Springfield. Investigators would later spend years examining every minute of that evening. They retraced driving routes across the city, compared witness statements, reviewed timelines from graduation parties, and carefully mapped the final confirmed movements of all three women. Every reported sighting became another piece of a puzzle that never seemed to fit together completely. Family photographs taken during graduation celebrations suddenly transformed from cherished memories into investigative evidence. Street maps helped detectives estimate travel times between parties and the house on East Delmer Street. Witness interviews attempted to narrow the exact moment the women disappeared, yet despite the extraordinary effort, the timeline always seemed to stop at the same place. The moment the three women entered that house, certainty disappeared with them. As the hours passed, the neighborhood remained quiet. Porch lights slowly switched off one by one. Traffic faded until only the occasional passing vehicle interrupted the stillness. Inside the home, there was every reason to believe the three women had gone to bed, expecting to wake up to an ordinary Sunday morning. Friends planned to meet them later that day. Family members expected phone calls. Life was supposed to continue exactly as it had the day before. None of the people who laughed with them during graduation celebrations, posed beside them for photographs, or waved goodbye that night imagined they had just shared their final moments together. None of them knew they had just been seen alive for the last time. Morning arrived with the quiet promise of another summer day. As sunlight spread across East Delmer Street, someone pulled into the driveway, walked toward the front porch, and knocked on the front door. What they were about to find would transform an ordinary missing person report into one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. The morning of June 7, 1992 began like any other summer morning in Springfield. Friends of Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall expected to see them later in the day. There were plans to continue celebrating graduation, and no one had any reason to believe anything was wrong. When the two teenagers failed to appear as expected, concern didn't immediately turn into panic. After all, they had spent the previous night celebrating. It wasn't unusual for young people to sleep in after a late evening, but as the hours passed, friends decided to stop by Sherrill Levitt's house on East Delmer Street to check on them. At first glance, the house looked completely ordinary. The cars belonging to the women were still parked outside, exactly where they should have been. That alone suggested nobody had left for an early morning errand or unexpected trip. As friends approached the front porch, however, they noticed something unusual. The glass globe covering the porch light had been shattered. Pieces of broken glass lay nearby. It was an odd detail, but not necessarily alarming on its own. Someone later speculated it may have been accidentally knocked over. Another person reportedly swept away the broken glass before investigators ever had the opportunity to examine it. At the time, nobody viewed the shattered porch light as potential evidence. They simply cleaned up what appeared to be a minor mess. The front door was unlocked. Again, that detail seemed unusual but not immediately alarming. Friends entered the home expecting to find Suzie, Stacy, and Sherrill asleep inside. Instead, they stepped into a scene that would later become one of the most puzzling environments investigators had ever encountered. The house felt occupied. The television was on. Lights inside the home remained illuminated. The family dog moved freely through the rooms. Nothing suggested the house had been abandoned. In fact, everything gave the impression that the women should have been there. But room after room sat empty. Friends called out their names. No answer. They checked bedrooms. No answer. They looked throughout the house. Still no answer. What made the situation increasingly unsettling was how normal everything appeared. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows, no obvious evidence that anyone had been harmed. Personal belongings remained exactly where they should have been. It looked less like three people had vanished and more like they had stepped out for a few minutes and simply forgotten to return. Then friends noticed something else. The women's purses. Inside the house sat the purses belonging to Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall. They had been left behind together. Wallets remained inside. Identification cards were still there. Personal items had not been taken. For investigators, this detail would eventually become one of the most important aspects of the case. Most people leaving voluntarily, even for a short period, take at least some personal belongings with them. Yet all three women appeared to have left behind nearly everything they would normally carry. The bedrooms added even more questions. The beds appeared to have been slept in. Nothing suggested the women had packed bags or prepared for travel. No notes were found explaining their absence. No messages indicated they intended to leave. The house existed in a strange state between occupancy and abandonment. Every object seemed frozen in place, preserving a moment that investigators could not fully understand. As concern grew, more people arrived at the home. Friends came and went. Family members stopped by. Some searched rooms hopping to find an explanation. Others answered ringing telephones. A few cleaned minor messes. Some moved objects without realizing they could be disturbing evidence. Their intentions were completely understandable. They were worried about loved ones and searching for answers. But what nobody realized at the time was that they were unknowingly altering what could become a major crime scene. Years later, investigators would acknowledge how difficult this made the case. The porch light globe had been cleaned up. People had walked throughout the house. Doors had been opened and closed. Objects had potentially been moved. Phone messages may have been erased. Footprints and fingerprints that might have existed were potentially compromised before police had the opportunity to secure the residence. What initially appeared to be a simple missing person situation was slowly transforming into something much more serious. As the day progressed, concern evolved into alarm. The women still had not returned. No one had heard from them. No one could explain where they had gone. The longer investigators examined the circumstances, the harder it became to find a reasonable explanation. Three women had apparently vanished from a home where nearly every sign suggested they should still be present. For detectives arriving on East Delmer Street, the scene raised immediate concerns. Missing adults often leave behind clues. A vehicle disappears. A financial transaction occurs. A witness reports seeing them. But in this case, the evidence seemed to stop abruptly at the front door. The cars remained. The purses remained. The house remained. Even the dog remained. Only the women were missing. As detectives began documenting every room, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the timeline, they realized this was not behaving like a typical missing person investigation. Something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong. Then detectives noticed something that immediately changed the investigation. A crucial piece of information suggested the women may not have left the house voluntarily at all. Suddenly, investigators were no longer treating East Delmer Street as the starting point of a routine disappearance. They were looking at the possible scene of an abduction. With the home secured and the realization growing that Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall had not simply left on their own. Investigators faced the difficult task of answering one critical question. What were the final confirmed movements of the three women before they disappeared? In almost every missing person investigation, the timeline becomes the foundation upon which every theory either stands or falls. Detectives knew that if they could account for every hour, every phone call, every witness, and every sighting during the previous 24 hours, they might uncover the moment when something went terribly wrong. It was painstaking work, requiring hundreds of interviews and careful comparisons of statements that often differed in small but important ways. Every minute mattered because somewhere within those final hours, investigators believed, lay the first real clue. The timeline began on Saturday, June 6, 1992. Throughout the day, Springfield was celebrating high school graduation. Friends, relatives, and classmates gathered for ceremonies and celebrations across the city. Witnesses consistently placed Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall among those attending graduation festivities. Multiple people remembered speaking with them, laughing with them, and seeing them move between different celebrations as the evening unfolded. These accounts painted the picture of two young women enjoying a milestone that millions of teenagers experience every year. Nothing about their behavior suggested fear, anxiety, or plans to suddenly disappear. Detectives later described these witness statements as remarkably ordinary, and in many ways that normality made the case even more unsettling. The final confirmed hours of their lives appeared completely routine. Investigators also worked to establish Sherrill Levitt's movements that same day. Friends and acquaintances later reported that Sherrill had spent time at home after completing various errands and household activities. By all available accounts, she expected her daughter to return later that night after graduation celebrations had concluded. Nothing indicated she had planned to leave the house or meet anyone during the early hours of Sunday morning. Like her daughter and Stacy, her final known activities reflected an ordinary day with ordinary expectations. Detectives found no confirmed evidence that Sherrill had expressed concern about anyone following her or threatening her. The absence of warning signs only deepened the mystery surrounding what happened next. As detectives reconstructed the evening, they confirmed that Suzie and Stacy attended more than one graduation gathering before deciding where to spend the night. Witnesses placed them at several locations, allowing investigators to build a fairly reliable sequence of events. Originally, the friends intended to stay at another residence after the celebrations. However, because too many people were already gathered there, they made a last-minute decision to spend the night instead at Sherrill's home on East Delmer Street. Investigators considered this change in plans extremely important. Only a limited number of people would have known about that decision, and it appeared to have been made only shortly before the women arrived at the house. Whether anyone else learned of that change, or whether it was simply a coincidence, became one of the earliest questions detectives attempted to answer. The final confirmed sightings placed Suzie and Stacy arriving at the East Delmer Street residence sometime after 2:00 a.m. Witnesses who saw them during those last moments described nothing unusual. They appeared relaxed and behaved exactly as they had throughout the evening. No confirmed witness reported seeing suspicious individuals following them directly to the house. Likewise, no neighbor later came forward with verified accounts of hearing screams, loud arguments, or sounds of violence during the night. Several neighbors recalled sleeping through the evening without interruption, while others remembered nothing that seemed unusual enough at the time to mention. Investigators canvassed the surrounding neighborhood repeatedly, hoping that someone might remember an overlooked detail. Yet despite extensive interviews, no single account provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. Telephone records became another important part of the investigation. In 1992, long before smartphones and digital location tracking, detectives relied heavily on landline records to establish communication patterns. Investigators reviewed available telephone information from the residents and attempted to determine who had contacted the home before and after the disappearance. Unfortunately, the technology of the time provided only limited information compared to what modern investigators might obtain today. Even so, detectives carefully documented every available call, searching for anything that appeared unusual or out of place. One particular detail quickly attracted significant attention. Friends who entered the house before police arrived later reported that the telephone had received a voicemail message that morning. According to those accounts, the caller left what was described as a strange or disturbing message. Before investigators had an opportunity to listen to it themselves, the message was reportedly erased. Because it no longer existed, detectives were never able to independently verify its exact contents or determine who had placed the call. Over the years, this missing voicemail has become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Here it is important to separate verified facts from later speculation. The verified fact is that witnesses reported an answering machine message was accidentally erased before investigators could examine it. What remains unverified are later claims describing exactly what the caller supposedly said. Various versions have circulated for decades, but because the recording no longer exists and investigators were unable to review it firsthand, none of those descriptions can be confirmed as factual. The erased message remains significant not because of what people believe it contained, but because it represented a potential piece of evidence that was permanently lost. As detectives continued refining the timeline, they compared witness interviews with travel times between graduation parties, estimated arrival times at the East Delmer Street home, and the sequence of events reported by the friends who discovered the empty residence the following morning. Large investigative boards displayed maps of Springfield with routes marked between celebration locations and the house. Timelines stretched across whiteboards, documenting each confirmed sighting minute by minute. Family photographs, graduation pictures, and witness statements were arranged side by side in an effort to reveal a pattern hidden beneath the ordinary details of that Saturday night. Yet no matter how many times investigators reviewed the evidence, the timeline always seemed to reach the same point before abruptly ending. After Suzie Streeter and Stacy McCall entered Sherrill Levitt's home, every confirmed movement stopped. It was as though the investigation had reached the edge of a cliff, with nothing beyond it except unanswered questions. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Every reported sighting after that night had to be carefully investigated, but many proved unreliable or impossible to verify. Detectives followed leads across state lines, interviewed countless witnesses, and pursued tips that arrived from people convinced they had seen one or more of the missing women. Most ultimately led nowhere. Even so, investigators refused to dismiss any possibility without examination, understanding that one credible witness could change the entire direction of the case. Then, as the investigation expanded and more information surfaced, detectives found themselves looking beyond the timeline itself. Certain names appeared more than once during interviews. Individuals with criminal histories, people connected to the neighborhood, and others whose circumstances drew investigative attention gradually entered the picture. None had been charged, and each required careful scrutiny before any conclusions could be drawn. For the first time, the investigation began pointing towards several possible suspects. As weeks passed without a breakthrough, investigators found themselves facing a difficult reality. The timeline had been reconstructed as completely as possible. The home had been searched repeatedly. Witnesses had been interviewed, re-interviewed, and compared against one another. Hundreds of tips had been evaluated. Yet the central question remained unanswered. If Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall had not left voluntarily, then someone else almost certainly knew what had happened. Detectives began shifting more of their attention toward the people who, for one reason or another, might have crossed paths with the three women during their final hours. It was an uncomfortable stage of the investigation. Every serious lead had to be pursued, regardless of how unlikely it initially appeared. But investigators also understood that suspicion alone is not evidence. Throughout the years, several individuals attracted law enforcement attention. Some were questioned extensively. Others became the subject of public speculation. None, however, have ever been charged in connection with the disappearances. One of the earliest names to emerge belonged to Michael Clay, a local man with a criminal history who had previously been accused of violent offenses unrelated to the Springfield Three case. Investigators examined his background because he fit certain general characteristics that detectives often consider in major investigations. He had been in the Springfield area, and his criminal record justified taking a closer look. Detectives interviewed him, reviewed his known movements, and compared available information against the established timeline. Over the years, his name continued to appear in media reports and public discussions, largely because of his past behavior. However, despite the attention surrounding him, investigators never announced that they possessed evidence directly connecting him to the disappearance of Sherrill, Suzie, or Stacy. Public suspicion remained, but suspicion by itself could not move the investigation forward. Another individual who drew investigative attention was Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and murderer whose criminal history immediately caught investigators' interest. Cox had lived in Springfield around the time the women disappeared, and his record of violent crimes naturally raised questions about whether he could have been involved. During later interviews while serving a prison sentence for unrelated offenses, Cox made statements suggesting he knew something about the case. Some reports quoted him as saying the women were dead and that their bodies would never be recovered. Those comments quickly generated headlines across the country. Detectives carefully evaluated every statement he made, hoping they had finally encountered someone with genuine knowledge of the case. But as investigators dug deeper, significant problems emerged. Cox repeatedly refused to provide verifiable details that only someone directly involved would have known. His statements often lacked specifics that could be independently confirmed. In addition, investigators examined information concerning his whereabouts during the critical time period. While some aspects of his timeline raised questions, authorities never developed sufficient evidence to charge him with involvement in the disappearance. To this day, many investigators acknowledge that Cox remains an intriguing figure in the investigation, yet no publicly released evidence has established his responsibility for what happened inside the East Delmer Street home. Detectives also explored individuals much closer to the victims' everyday lives. Whenever people vanish without explanation, investigators routinely begin by examining family members, close friends, former romantic partners, coworkers, and anyone known to have regular contact with the missing individuals. It is a standard investigative procedure, not an indication of guilt. Friends of Suzie Streeter, acquaintances from graduation celebrations, neighbors living near the residence, and numerous other people were interviewed extensively. Detectives compared their statements, verified alibis where possible, and searched for inconsistencies that might justify additional investigation. While rumors circulated within the community suggesting that certain individuals behaved strangely after the disappearances, investigators repeatedly emphasized that rumors cannot replace evidence. Many people found themselves discussed publicly despite there being no confirmed proof linking them to the crime. Another theory centered on the possibility that the women encountered someone entirely unknown to them. Detectives considered whether an opportunistic offender could have observed Suzie and Stacy during graduation celebrations, learned of their last-minute decision to stay at Sherrill's home, and followed them there. This theory attempted to explain why there appeared to be no obvious conflict involving family members or close acquaintances before the disappearance. However, proving such a scenario presented enormous challenges. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses who reported seeing someone follow the women directly to the house. No surveillance cameras existed along their route. The lack of physical evidence meant investigators could neither confirm nor completely dismiss the possibility. As media coverage intensified, countless theories spread beyond official investigative channels. Some suggested organized criminal activity. Others claimed the disappearances were connected to unrelated crimes occurring elsewhere in Missouri during that period. Anonymous callers contacted newspapers and television stations with dramatic stories, while self-proclaimed witnesses insisted they possessed secret information overlooked by police. Every significant claim required examination, but the overwhelming majority ultimately failed to withstand scrutiny. Detectives found themselves separating credible information from a growing flood of speculation, understanding that false leads consumed valuable time and resources that could otherwise be spent pursuing genuine evidence. One of the greatest frustrations for investigators was the absence of forensic evidence directly identifying a suspect. No confirmed fingerprints placed an unknown offender inside the home. No verified DNA evidence pointed toward a specific individual. The crime scene itself had been unintentionally disturbed before police secured the residence, making the collection and interpretation of physical evidence even more difficult. Without clear forensic support, detectives were forced to rely heavily on witness testimony, timelines, behavioral analysis, and corroborated investigative leads. Each new person of interest seemed to raise fresh questions while providing very few definitive answers. Over time, investigators became increasingly careful about public statements concerning potential suspects. They understood the consequences of accusing someone without sufficient evidence. Throughout the investigation, authorities consistently distinguished between individuals they had interviewed, persons of investigative interest, and suspects against whom they possessed actual evidence. That distinction remains important today. Although several names have appeared repeatedly in documentaries, books, and news reports, no one has ever been formally charged with the disappearance of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, or Stacy McCall. The case remains officially unsolved, and investigators continue to encourage anyone with credible information to come forward. Just when detectives believed they were beginning to narrow the field of possibilities, an entirely different lead emerged, one that shifted attention away from familiar names and toward a location that many believed might finally hold the answer. It was unexpected, difficult to verify, and would become one of the most debated developments in the history of the Springfield Three investigation. As months turned into years and years into decades, the disappearance of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall became more than a local investigation. It became one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. With every anniversary came renewed media attention. Television specials revisited the case, newspapers published retrospectives, internet forums filled with thousands of discussions. Every new generation of investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths returned to the same evidence, hoping they might notice something everyone else had missed. But the longer the case remained unsolved, the more difficult it became to separate documented facts from stories that had grown larger with time. Detectives found themselves not only searching for three missing women, but also navigating a maze of rumors, speculation, and misinformation that threatened to obscure the truth. The theory investigators considered most seriously from the beginning was that the women had been abducted. Unlike many public theories that developed later, this possibility was grounded in the physical evidence, or perhaps more accurately, the absence of it. The house showed no convincing indication that Sherrill, Suzie, or Stacy had chosen to leave voluntarily. Their purses remained inside. Personal belongings had been left untouched. Their vehicles sat in the driveway exactly where they had been parked the night before. There was no confirmed evidence that any of the three women packed clothing, withdrew money, or made preparations to leave Springfield. For detectives, these facts strongly suggested that whatever happened occurred unexpectedly. Whether the women left the home under threat, deception, or force has never been established publicly, but investigators have long regarded an involuntary disappearance as one of the most plausible explanations based on the available evidence. As news of the case spread across the country, some observers wondered whether a serial offender could have been responsible. Missouri and neighboring states had experienced violent crimes involving multiple offenders during previous years, prompting inevitable comparisons. Investigators examined known violent offenders whose movements placed them within the broader region during that period. They reviewed criminal histories, interviewed individuals already serving prison sentences, and compared unsolved cases for possible similarities. While certain offenders attracted attention because of their backgrounds, detectives never publicly announced that forensic evidence connected any known serial offender to the Springfield Three case. The theory remained one possibility among many, but no definitive evidence has ever confirmed it. Another rumor suggested organized criminal activity played a role in the disappearance. Over the years, stories circulated claiming the women may have witnessed something they were never supposed to see, or that someone connected to criminal organizations had targeted them. These claims gained attention because they appeared to offer an explanation for how three adults could disappear without leaving obvious evidence behind. However, investigators repeatedly emphasized that no publicly confirmed evidence established a connection between the disappearance and organized crime. Despite the persistence of these rumors, authorities have never identified verified records, financial transactions, or witness testimony supporting such claims. As compelling as the stories sounded, they remain speculation rather than established fact. Among the most talked about developments in the investigation was a tip involving a parking garage. Several years after the disappearance, information surfaced suggesting that human remains might be buried beneath the foundation of a parking structure in Springfield. The claim generated enormous public interest because it appeared to offer investigators a specific location to search rather than another vague theory. Reports indicated that ground-penetrating radar had identified anomalies beneath the concrete, leading many people to believe a major breakthrough was imminent. News coverage fueled public anticipation, and countless observers became convinced the mystery was finally about to be solved. But the situation proved far more complicated. Investigators faced practical and legal challenges in determining whether excavation was justified. Removing sections of an active parking structure required substantial resources, engineering considerations, and evidence strong enough to support such an operation. Although the reported tip received attention, authorities ultimately did not recover evidence confirming that Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, or Stacy McCall were buried beneath the structure. To this day, the parking garage remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Supporters believe it deserves further investigation, while others argue the available information has never met the threshold necessary to justify excavation. The theory remains unresolved, neither confirmed nor disproven. Another frequently discussed lead involved reports of a green van seen in the neighborhood around the time of the disappearances. Multiple witnesses came forward over the years describing a green vehicle that reportedly attracted their attention during the relevant time period. Detectives took these reports seriously because witness sightings near a crime scene can occasionally provide valuable investigative leads. Officers attempted to identify similar vehicles, interview owners, and determine whether any could be linked to the East Delmer Street residence. Yet as investigators compared statements, they encountered a familiar challenge. Witness memories often differed on important details such as the model, shade of green, exact location, and timing. Without consistent descriptions or corroborating evidence, detectives were unable to establish that any particular vehicle played a role in the disappearance. While the reports remained part of the investigative record, none resulted in a confirmed breakthrough. As public fascination with the mystery continued to grow, another category of claims emerged, those involving psychics and self-proclaimed mediums. Several individuals publicly stated they had visions revealing where the women could be found or identifying those responsible. Some contacted investigators directly. Others appeared on television or spoke to newspapers, attracting considerable public attention. Law enforcement agencies occasionally receive such information in high-profile investigations, and the Springfield Three case was no exception. However, investigators have consistently relied on verifiable evidence rather than supernatural claims when making investigative decisions. Despite the publicity surrounding these psychic predictions, none have produced publicly confirmed evidence leading to the discovery of Sherrill, Suzie, or Stacy. They remain part of the public history surrounding the case but not part of its established evidentiary record. Perhaps one of the greatest obstacles detectives faced was not the lack of information but the overwhelming amount of unreliable information. Thousands of tips poured into the investigation from across the United States. Some callers sincerely believed they had seen one of the missing women. Others reported suspicious conversations, anonymous confessions, or alleged eyewitness accounts that could never be verified. Every credible lead required investigators to devote time and resources to determine whether it contained genuine value. Many ultimately proved to be misunderstandings, mistaken identities, or rumors repeated so often that they began to sound like facts. The longer the investigation continued, the more difficult it became to distinguish fresh evidence from recycled speculation. Investigators have often reminded the public that high-profile unsolved cases naturally attract myths. Stories become embellished as they pass from one person to another. Details are added, removed, or unintentionally altered over time. In the Springfield Three investigation, this process created a second mystery alongside the first, the challenge of separating what actually happened from what people believed might have happened. For detectives, preserving that distinction has always been essential. Every verified fact carries weight. Every unsupported rumor risks sending the investigation down another dead end. Even after decades of investigation, one reality has never changed. The house on East Delmer Street still marks the last confirmed location where Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall were known to be alive. Every theory eventually returns to that single point in the timeline, where certainty ends and unanswered questions begin. Decades later, one question still refuses to go away. If someone knows what happened inside that house, why has the truth remained hidden for more than 30 years? More than 30 years have passed since Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall disappeared from the home on East Delmer Street, yet the investigation continues to occupy a unique place in American criminal history. It is not simply because three women vanished without explanation. It is because investigators were confronted with a case that seemed to lose valuable pieces almost from the very beginning. As detectives have often explained, solving any investigation depends on preserving evidence, verifying witness accounts, and building a timeline that can withstand careful examination. In this case, each of those foundations was weakened before investigators fully understood the scale of what they were facing. The result was an investigation that became increasingly difficult with every passing hour, despite the tireless efforts of law enforcement and the continued determination of the victims' families. One of the greatest challenges was the loss of potential evidence during the first critical hours after the women were discovered missing. Friends and relatives who entered the house that morning believed they were responding to an unusual but harmless situation. They expected to find Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy somewhere nearby. Acting out of genuine concern, they searched the home, answered telephone calls, opened doors, walked through rooms, and cleaned up broken glass from the shattered porch light. Their actions were completely understandable given what they believed at the time. Unfortunately, investigators later recognized that the residence may have been a crime scene. By then, countless opportunities to preserve its original condition had already been lost. Detectives have never suggested that those friends or family members acted with anything other than good intentions, but the reality remains that every additional person entering the home increased the possibility that valuable evidence could have been unintentionally disturbed. The reportedly erased voicemail became another painful reminder of how fragile evidence can be. According to witness accounts, a message left on the home's answering machine was accidentally deleted before investigators had an opportunity to examine it. Because the recording no longer exists, detectives were deprived of the chance to determine who placed the call, exactly what was said, or whether it had any connection to the disappearance. Over the years, many stories have circulated describing the contents of that message, but none can be verified. What investigators know with certainty is that a potentially important piece of information disappeared forever before it could be analyzed. Whether it would have changed the course of the investigation will never be known. Witness testimony also became increasingly difficult to evaluate as time passed. Human memory is remarkably powerful, but it is not perfect. Investigators understand that memories naturally change over weeks, months, and years. Small details become blurred. Conversations become harder to place in sequence. People unintentionally combine separate events into one recollection or become influenced by repeated media coverage. Detectives interviewed witnesses repeatedly in an effort to identify consistent details, but even sincere witnesses occasionally remembered events differently as time passed. That does not necessarily mean anyone was being dishonest. It reflects the challenge investigators face in virtually every long-term case, especially one receiving constant public attention. The timing of the investigation also presented significant limitations. In 1992, forensic science was advancing rapidly, but many of the tools investigators rely upon today either did not exist or were still in their early stages of development. Modern DNA analysis is far more sensitive than it was 3 decades ago. Today's investigators have access to sophisticated digital imaging, advanced fingerprint enhancement, forensic genealogy in certain cases, improved biological testing, and powerful computer systems capable of organizing enormous amounts of investigative information. None of those resources were available in the same way when Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall disappeared. Detectives worked diligently with the technology available to them, but many opportunities that modern investigators might pursue simply were not possible at the time. Even so, the passage of time has not ended the investigation. Law enforcement agencies have periodically re-examined evidence using improved forensic techniques whenever appropriate. Cold case investigations often involve reviewing original files with fresh perspectives, comparing evidence against newly developed databases, and reevaluating witness statements in light of information unavailable during the initial investigation. While authorities have not publicly announced any breakthrough resulting from these reviews, advances in forensic science continue to offer cautious hope that unanswered questions could one day receive clearer answers. Public interest has also played an important role in keeping the investigation alive. Over the years, the Springfield Three case has been featured in documentaries, investigative television programs, newspaper retrospectives, podcasts, books, and online discussions devoted to unsolved mysteries. Each new feature introduces the case to another generation of viewers and listeners, some of whom were not even born when the women disappeared. The internet has allowed researchers, journalists, and members of the public to study timelines, compare archived news reports, and revisit evidence in ways that were impossible during the early 1990s. While online discussions sometimes generate speculation unsupported by evidence, they have also helped ensure that the case has not been forgotten. Detectives have often acknowledged that renewed public attention can occasionally encourage someone with previously overlooked information to come forward. At the same time, investigators continue to urge caution when evaluating information shared online. High-profile unsolved cases naturally attract theories, assumptions, and repeated claims that may gradually be mistaken for established facts. Responsible investigation requires distinguishing between documented evidence, credible witness testimony, and unsupported speculation. That distinction has become increasingly important as social media allows information to spread rapidly, regardless of its accuracy. For the families of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, every rumor carries emotional weight. For investigators, every unsupported claim must be measured against the evidence rather than public opinion. Despite every challenge, the case has never officially been closed. Detectives continue to regard it as an active investigation. Files remain preserved. Evidence continues to be available for future examination when appropriate. Authorities have repeatedly stated that even the smallest credible piece of new information could prove significant. History has shown that cold cases can sometimes be solved decades after the crimes occurred through advances in science, renewed witness cooperation, or the discovery of overlooked evidence. There is no guarantee that such a breakthrough will occur here, but investigators have never abandoned the possibility. More than 3 decades after that quiet summer night in Springfield, the same questions continue to echo through the empty rooms of the house on East Delmer Street. What happened after Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall walked through the front door? Who was responsible? And why has no one ever been held accountable? The investigation has survived changes in technology, changes in investigative teams, and changes in public attention, yet its central mystery remains untouched. If the answers still exist, someone may still be carrying them. More than 30 years have passed since that warm June night in Springfield, Missouri, but time has done very little to quiet the questions left behind. The house on East Delmer Street has changed over the years. Families have come and gone. The neighborhood has continued with everyday life. Children who were not yet born when the disappearance occurred have grown into adults. Seasons have changed thousands of times. Yet for those who have followed this case from the beginning, one image remains impossible to forget. A modest home where everything appeared normal, except for the three people who should have been inside. Long after the police tape came down and the television cameras disappeared, the mystery remained. The walls of that house no longer tell investigators anything new, but they continue to remind everyone of how quickly an ordinary evening became one of the most perplexing criminal investigations in American history. For the families of Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall, the passage of time has never erased the uncertainty. Every holiday, every birthday, and every family milestone has carried the weight of unanswered questions. Unlike cases that end with arrests, trials, and convictions, this investigation has offered no final chapter. There has been no courtroom testimony explaining what happened during those early morning hours. No confession has provided closure. No verified discovery has answered where the three women went after they entered the house on East Delmer Street. Instead, their loved ones have lived with something far more difficult: the absence of certainty. In many ways, uncertainty can become its own kind of sentence, leaving families suspended between hope and heartbreak without ever reaching a clear conclusion. The investigation itself has become part of the legacy of the case. Detectives have come and gone over the decades, each reviewing the same evidence with fresh determination. Investigative techniques have evolved dramatically since 1992, and every advancement has brought renewed optimism that one overlooked detail might finally reveal the truth. Yet despite years of interviews, countless tips, extensive searches, and careful examination of every credible lead, the central mystery remains unchanged. The evidence still begins at the house. The timeline still ends there. Every theory eventually circles back to the same unanswered moment between the women arriving home and the following morning, when friends walked through the unlocked front door and discovered a house that appeared frozen in time. What makes this case so enduring is not simply that three women disappeared. It is the extraordinary absence of answers. Cases involving missing persons often leave investigators with at least one clear direction to pursue: a vehicle to trace, financial activity to examine, surveillance footage to review, or reliable eyewitness accounts to follow. Here, nearly every path seems to end as abruptly as it begins. The purses remained. The cars remained. Personal belongings remained exactly where they had been left. Even the family dog remained inside the home. Everything that should have accompanied an ordinary Sunday morning was still there. Only Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall were missing. Over the years, countless theories have attempted to explain what happened. Some have sounded convincing until examined closely. Others have been based on little more than rumor repeated often enough to feel believable. Throughout this documentary, we have carefully separated verified facts from speculation because the truth deserves that distinction. In a case this significant, accuracy matters. Every confirmed piece of evidence carries value. Every unsupported claim risks pulling attention away from the facts that investigators continue to rely upon, more than 3 decades later. That commitment to evidence remains just as important as it was on the first day of the investigation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this mystery is the possibility that someone somewhere still knows exactly what happened. Investigators have long believed that answers do not simply disappear. Memories fade, circumstances change, relationships evolve, and loyalties shift. History has shown that even the most challenging cold cases can be solved many years later when a witness decides to speak, when new evidence is uncovered, or when advances in forensic science reveal what was once impossible to detect. Whether that day will ever come in the Springfield Three investigation remains unknown. But until every credible lead has been exhausted, the search for the truth continues. 3 women disappeared from what should have been one of the safest places imaginable, their own home. No arrests, no confirmed suspects, no definitive explanation. More than 3 decades later, the silence surrounding that house continues to echo. The names Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall remain forever connected to one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, a case that continues to challenge investigators and remind us how fragile certainty can be. Somewhere between the ordinary events of a graduation celebration and the quiet sunrise that followed, something happened that changed countless lives forever. Until that missing piece of the story is found, the final chapter has yet to be written. What do you believe happened to Sherrill Levitt, Suzie Streeter, and Stacy McCall? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Your perspective may contribute to a thoughtful discussion about one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. If you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries grounded in verified evidence, consider subscribing for more investigations into history's most enduring mysteries. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.